Welcome everyone to this vodcast for John Menadew's blog site and policy forum Pearls and Irritations. We're going to canvass the horrendous Israel-Gaza conflict and the capabilities or lack thereof of Australia's mainstream media. Joining us is the great truth-telling journalist Mary Kostakidis, who has now written extensively on this, particularly trying to highlight the gaps in our knowledge. Mary presented SBS World News for 2 decades. She is a former consultant to the National Consultation on the Protection of Human Rights. She has been a freelance journalist since leaving SBS, covering geopolitics, foreign policy, democracy and press freedom, from David Hicks to David McBride, Ukraine, AUKUS and Gaza. She's been using Twitter extensively to cover the Assange case, as well as the ICJ and ICC referrals. So Mary, welcome. Thanks for doing this. Tell us just quickly, what's the latest with Assange?
Julian Assange. Well, he had a 2-day appeal hearing recently, which I was not permitted to observe for the first time. The court decided that journalists outside the jurisdiction would not have access. But the most important, the most significant thing that happened, in my view, is this. At the end of the hearing, the judge asked the barrister representing the Home Secretary, is it possible for additional charges to be laid? And the answer was yes. Charges that attract the death penalty. The answer was yes. Have assurances been provided that that would not be imposed? And the answer was it's very difficult to offer those assurances. So we have a situation where the Home Secretary has approved an extradition really in breach of the UK's own laws. So I'm hopeful that the court will find in his favour and allow an appeal, although this shouldn't be a matter of an appeal. The extradition approval should be withdrawn, but the court hasn't announced its decision yet. If they decide there's no appeal, then he could be on the next plane out to the US. There is one further avenue, if you like, and that is to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. So it'll be a race to get that in before they get him onto a plane.
All right, a very tense wait for the journalists of the world. The title of our talk is Accessory to Genocide in Gaza. We're recording this broadcast on the afternoon of Monday, the 11th of March 2024. I'm saying that because the situation in Gaza changes very quickly. The death toll is acknowledged to be over 30,000, children and women mainly. There are now airdrops of food aid, some with unintended tragic consequences. President Biden is trying to build a jetty for delivery of aid from Cyprus by sea over the next 60 days. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu is asserting that victory over Hamas is at hand, but there has been no formal declaration of a ceasefire in return for the release of the remaining Israeli hostages. Netanyahu has rejected President Biden's recent remark when he said that Netanyahu was hurting Israel more than helping Israel. Mary, before we get to the media and our failings, please take us through the application of international law, which is meant to constrain combatants on humanitarian grounds to prevent the killing of innocent men, women and children.
Will do, but Quentin, if I could just comment on a couple of things in the introduction. Firstly, footage coming out of Rafah and eyewitness reports both suggest that the deaths have not been unfortunate, accidental, unintentional, that people are being shot. Starving people who are scrambling for food are being shot. Secondly, the proposal to build a pier to deliver food is seen by many as a cynical proposal, because death from starvation does not wait for the construction of a pier to deliver food. What ought to be happening is that they ought to open up the crossings into Gaza and allow humanitarian aid to come through. They need food, water, and medicine now. Children have already started dying of starvation days ago. We've seen emaciated bodies of adults as well. The effects of starvation, the physical and intellectual consequences of not having nutrients at a critical age of your development, means that they will bear those scars, physical and intellectual, for the rest of their lives, as well as the emotional and mental scars of lost limbs, seeing their parents and siblings blown up. And just one final point on the hostages. We talk about the hostages, the Israeli hostages, the Israeli citizens that are being held hostage. But the fact is that the Palestinians consider that the thousands of people, Palestinian people held in Israeli prisons, are state abductees. They are hostages. So this is the critical issue for them and the critical issue for Hamas. And a UN humanitarian group has reported recently that many of those people have been tortured or abused. To go to your question now about war crimes, well, and the most heinous of which, of course, is considered to be genocide, where both state leaders and combatants can be held to account. International humanitarian law was set by Nuremberg and the Geneva Conventions, which defined war crimes and established universal jurisdiction. And the Rome Statute empowers the ICC, where the crimes are prosecuted. Now, the war crimes for combatants range from plundering, the sorts of videos that the IDF have uploaded themselves, showing them looting stores and plundering jewellery and other possessions that Palestinians have left behind, all the way through to the treatment of prisoners and these summary execution of civilians and POWs. So, for example, impersonating health workers and walking into a hospital and then summarily killing injured people in hospital beds, or entering a room and shooting dead a 73-year-old deaf man who's imploring them not to shoot him. Evidence of large numbers of almost naked men in the cold or in stress positions or positions of subjugation, and large numbers of bodies in plastic bags being thrown onto trucks in a way perhaps that animals might be disposed of. Some of the most enduring images in this episode in history, I think, will be that of the devastation of bombed housing and the families that lie beneath the rubble, children that were rescued alive or pulled out dead from the rubble, knowing that people were still trapped underneath, and the countless number of limp, lifeless bodies of children and massively traumatised children with shocking injuries. Now, anyone who gets their news from the mainstream media won't be seeing the worst of that, which is the vast majority of what we're seeing online. But this will no doubt form evidence in the ICJ case against Israel. You and I both know why that material isn't made available on mainstream media. But today, in the digital age, we need to give people that option to view it if they choose to. The problem with what happened in Iraq, because we participated in destroying an entire country, is that you have to see what the effect of what you're doing to engage with it and to develop the moral outrage that's required, because in these sorts of circumstances, moral outrage is the proportionate and appropriate response. Now, South Africa has warned its citizens that if they fight with the IDF, they will be prosecuted on their return under domestic legislation. And Australia would be prudent to advise their citizens that participation may result in prosecution under international law.
Well, just take us through the ICE International Criminal Court referral of the Albanese government, because that had little play in the mainstream media.
Yes, indeed. So whilst the Australian government has failed to respond in any way to the serious International Court of Justice decision, which I hope we'll get to later, civil society has in various ways. One is the statement of the ICJ, supported by 100 civil society organisations, initiated by a former Labor Minister, Margaret Reynolds, and the senior public servant, Alison Belnowski. There's a court action here challenging the granting of export licences to firms supplying Israel with arms parts and raw materials used in making arms. And then there's the referral of our Prime Minister and other senior leaders to the ICC. Now, the ICC referral is a historic one because it's the first referral of a Western leader. The Prime Minister and Minister Wong and others are accused of accessorial liability for genocide through diplomatic, political and material support for Israel, while it's been killing men, women and children in their tens of thousands. And while senior Israeli public figures justify and encourage ethnic cleansing and genocide, including Israel's Prime Minister and others who refer to children as Hamas in waiting. Now, how have we done this? Well, they're saying we've done this by continuing to supply arms parts to Israel, including for its bomber aircraft that Israel is using to kill large numbers of Palestinian civilians and destroy any trace, in fact, of Palestinian civilization. And by approving,
Go on, Mary.
By approving export licenses to firms supporting Israel's arms production. And the ICC referral referenced two declassified Australia reports, one on our supply of parts for bomber aircraft, and one about the role of Pine Gap, where former signals analysis officer revealed that Pine Gap monitors the Gaza Strip and gathers intelligence useful to Israel. And then also by suspending funding to UNRWA, the main relief agency operating in Israel, based on unverified Israeli allegations. So what you would expect in this situation, because of the disastrous repercussions, that until the results of the investigation are available, that would not have occurred, particularly in this case where staff were immediately suspended precisely to avoid the loss of financial support. Now, the Rome Statute stipulates that a person is criminally responsible if they facilitate the commission of a crime, including providing the means for its commission. So the referral claims the Australian government has done so in breach of its legal duty as a signatory to the Genocide Convention, where states are required to take steps reasonably available to them to prevent genocide, or even where there's a risk of genocide. Now, the ICJ has established that there's more than a risk. It's declared it is a plausible genocide. So
I'll get to that. I just want to stop you there, Mary. Thank you so much for that. But I just have to note that the Prime Minister Albanese it's like Biden, I suppose. Biden's in the same bind, trying now with Egypt, Cyprus, because of the desperation of the situation in Rafah and Gaza, that they are trying hard on humanitarian aid, but at the same time still providing arms to Israel, as you say, which may well be in breach of the conventions. Albanese has denied he has genocidal intent from representing Australia, supplying arms to Israel. Penny Wong has yet to order, as you say, the resumption of Australia's aid through UNRWA. This is a geostrategic alliance of the United States and Australia with Israel. That's why there's the hypocrisy that has been well identified now.
Yes, that's right. So we have one rule for our friends and one rule for not friends. So this is a huge problem, and to continue to refer to Israel as our friend, a country that the ICJ has found is committing plausible genocide, is a terrible look for Australia. It's also a huge slap in the face, frankly, for our Palestinian Australian community and for the growing community around the world of citizens who are appalled at what Israel is doing and whose view of Israel now has changed irrevocably. It's delegitimized itself, really. I don't know what can be done to restore that. I mean, the international community really has to pull together, stop enabling Israel to continue doing this and come up with a just solution to really a 75-year-old problem that was created by the West to begin with.
They're great historic points, and we all have to grapple with them. But Mary, the Egyptian President Sisi has estimated that the cost of rebuilding Gaza would be 90 billion at the moment, and we would all have to, all the countries of goodwill would have to help the rebuilding of Palestine and to start the debate about that, particularly as Netanyahu has said that he predicts that the war on Hamas will be completed. They'll claim victory within 6 to 8 weeks. Needless to say, I'm hopeful that the ceasefire comes in and that the whole of the international community can move to a pathway for the rebuilding of Gaza. Is that a possibility? Or I know the situation is so desperate at the moment.
I think the critical issue really is to stop people dying of starvation. That's got to be the very first thing that the international community does. You talk about rebuilding Gaza after that, but what's clear is that over 75 years, Palestinian people have been herded into smaller and smaller and smaller areas. They're now, a lot of them, down near the Egypt border. They are starving. They're starting to die of starvation, and we need to just open up and allow access. And really, the United States can do that. The United States can stop funding Israel, can stop arms to Israel. Israel can't continue doing, it wouldn't have been able to do what it's done for 75 years if the US hadn't supported it, if the US hadn't voted against every UN resolution against Israel, if it hadn't used its Security Council veto constantly.
And Russia uses its Security Council veto. I know it's perverse. Uses its Security Council veto on things like Ukraine, for example, which has confronted the West with its failings and its deficiencies. So, what is the way ahead? Desperately urgent humanitarian aid to the Palestinians now to stop the starvation. Understand that as of today, the 11th of March 2024, and if that can be secured, that would be a sigh of relief for everyone.
And the Australian government really should reinstate UNRWA funding immediately. It should have already done so. It should end military and intelligence support to Israel, and it should end political and diplomatic support. You know, as we were saying earlier, it's just entirely hypocritical to have one rule for your friends and a different rule for people you don't like. Really, since the ICJ decision, Western leaders have gone from expressing concern to now expressing grave concern and urging Israel to be more careful. And I'm afraid international law demands rather more than that.
Israel is losing the remnant public support all around the world because of the verified images and the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza now. But Netanyahu still has the very strong support of the Israeli people across the political system within Israel. I see that. I'm an old political reporter. I see that as the major problem. Because
Yes.
the Israelis, it's like after 9/11, the Israelis have been united on that, including the destruction and what seems to many people to be the genocidal intent after October 7.
Yes, that's right, and that's what people like Gideon Levy and other people inside Israel are saying, that there is a lot of support among the Israeli public. So without a doubt, the Zionist aspirations and goals are held very dear by a lot of people within Israel. It doesn't make them right. Certainly, if you're going to have a state where you've got two categories of citizens, where one category is under military law, they can be arrested and thrown behind bars without charge for, I don't know, throwing stones, and held there indefinitely. It's just it's not a situation of apartheid, and it's just not tenable, not in today's world.
Right. There's a lot of brain power being expended on how we can get out of it. Thanks for canvassing that. But in the time available, Mary, I just want you to concentrate on the Australian media, because all the things that you've said, although it's been in blog sites like Pearls and Irritations, it hasn't got. It's almost as if we know about the Murdoch press's unquestioning support for the IDF in this current situation, but 9 newspapers have abandoned the field. The ABC has redeemed itself. There's a Four Corners tonight by John Lyons in some aspects, but it seems to be the same. What is wrong with the Australian media? I know it's difficult to cover war. We can't get people into Gaza. We're relying on video footage and audio from all the sources that are coming out of Gaza where the phone system does work. But what is the major problem with the Australian media in getting accurate, verified information to the public?
The problem with the Australian media, several problems. One is that they're conformist. Like many of our politicians, they want to depict the world as one of goodies and baddies with little chance of any alternative perspective. So there's no real balance and or enough evaluation of what we are being told by politicians, and there are inherent biases in reporting that are never questioned, Quentin. Neutrality in journalism is considered the ultimate virtue, but what we need is objectivity during the investigation or examination of what's before us, knowledge of the historical context, access to information from both sides of a dispute. These are long-standing problems, including the very different language in headlines and stories depending on who the dead people are and who the perpetrators are. The so-called war on terror, for example, was a war of terror, but we just didn't see the impact on Iraqis other than in that collateral murder video that WikiLeaks released. The only way that I was able to circumvent that mantra was by attempting to ensure that when I said, use those words, it was President Bush's war on terror or Prime Minister John Howard says the war on terror, and if not to say the so-called war on terror, using my need to be neutral as a presenter.
The challenge for journalists is to cut through the propaganda in the language which is used, say, for example, on terror.
Well, the language that's used, and also who we turn to as experts and who we allow a voice, whether we allow both sides a voice. I mean, a recent example of this bias is the homemade bomb incident, where, which would have been classified as a terrorist act if it had been a Muslim involved. So having worked in the newsroom for 20 years, I've seen the impact of the Zionist Israeli lobby groups. They have unfettered access to the top echelons. They wine and dine chief producers, and they fund junkets to Israel for journalists where they're pumped with propaganda. Now, I know other countries do the junkets, but no one, I don't think, does it as well as...
that's wargaming public opinion, soft power, if you can win the public relations argument. And many think tanks...
It's not actually soft power. It's pretty hard. It's pretty hard.
It's wargaming power.
Yeah, but it all has to stop. Palestinians don't have that access to the top echelons of, media, and they don't have the money to do the other stuff. And I'll give you an example of the result of that sort of thing. During every flare-up in the Middle East, I'd had crossed to Mark Regev regularly for comment as a spokesperson for the Israeli government, sometimes several times a week. And on one occasion, I asked the chief producer, who happened to just return from a junket to Israel, why don't we have a Palestinian on tonight for a change? And his response was, no, they're all mad anyway. Right, so the fact is that despite Quentin, despite all the expectations and accolades, SBS largely failed to contemplate an alternative perspective when it came to the angle we took on stories. The reality is, at the end of the night, after watching all the monitors in the newsroom and saying exactly the same thing about important stories, we all slap ourselves on the back, because furious agreement is validation. We got it right. The punters, as they're referred to, will be happy. I knew there were people who knew a lot more about the issue than we did, and were probably either laughing their heads off or wanting to throw a brick at their television. Another example, if I may, is the Sheikh Taj Eddin al-Hilali story, which was a massive beat-up that we participated in the middle of fear-mongering to sell the so-called war on terror. So the Arabic-speaking journalist that was sent by the Australian to listen to the sermon of an imam came back with no evidence of incitement to terrorism. So they decided to out him as what? Being politically incorrect. And it created a media storm. It's on all the front pages, led all the bulletins. I did try and say, hang on, guys, I grew up with that sort of metaphor. There are priests that still use metaphors like that. My Sunday school teacher told the boys that we, as 12-year-old girls, were the devil. And look, I might as well have been a Martian, because the editorial decision makers bite at the bit to join in the baying for blood. There's a club mentality. So whilst I regularly point out what I consider the ABC's failings on the X platform, I'm trying to even up the score by telling you a little bit about what I think SBS has done wrong too. And you mentioned John Lyons. Now, he's a standout, but you have to look at 24/7 coverage across the ABC platforms, and you have to look at how easily the ABC caved into lobbyists in the case of Antoinette Lattouf, whose supervisor admitted in court, in fact, she was not warned by the ABC about posting on social media. She did not see a problem with the post about a Human Rights Watch statement. Politicians may receive donations from lobby groups, but the media, Quentin, needs stronger, as I'm sure we agree on this, more independent management and journalism.
Well, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for editorial leaders, all in Australian media, to cut through what is the proprietorial, or what was called in the ABC the preemptive buckle. You've got a problem. There's going to be complaints. Let's get ahead of it, and fix what they perceive to be the problem, rather than go to what is the truth of the matter. We've got to be fearless in substantiating what we're doing, and we're going to get it up. We're going to broadcast this.
And also, I think journalism codes need to be disrupted and reconstituted to address the problems that really encourage conformity and laziness, allow for unexamined biases.
I think the current journalist code is pretty good, Mary. It's the proprietor that has the call. If I present a story that the executive producer doesn't like, well, it can be dropped, and that happens. And so, in a careerist sense for journalists, people say, "Oh, well, I won't. I've got a." It's self-censorship that can be built into the hierarchical structures
I agree with you, but I think there's also a problem with the code because words like bias, balance, neutrality, they're all weaponized. And the important thing is not to be neutral towards an issue. The important thing is to be objective towards an issue. And
Well,
the whole notion of...
we agree on that. It's public right to know and truth telling.
Yeah, and the whole issue of balance sometimes ensures that the imbalance in the very situation that we're looking at, where you have one side that's very powerful and one side that isn't, mean that we contribute to ensuring that that injustice, that lack of balance continues, because we're not exposing what's actually happening, because we're worried about not being biased and not being neutral. So we become part of the problem rather than holding power to account. Now, and one final example, if I may, that the government has ignored the ICJ finding, making it easier for the media to ignore it. And consequently, there's no public discourse about our obligations under international law. So the public remains largely ignorant about that. And so the failure of the media contributes to the delegitimization of those international instruments. And this is something that we have to ensure stops. We really have to take a different approach. So I do think there needs to be a shake-up.
I accept what you're saying. On a positive note, social media and its platforms globally have changed the power dynamic, have they not?
Oh, absolutely. But look at what's happened to social media. So once upon a time, you had journalists on the left, running their independent media.
I don't like left. I don't like it's old Cold War terminology, left and right. And
yes, exactly. That's what I'm getting at. Nowadays, you've got people like Tucker Carlson, John Mearsheimer, Mehdi Hassan. They're all having to go independent as well, and they're appearing on left-wing platforms, and that old division between left and right has gone out the window. What you're left with is a conformist mainstream media that basically delivers the same old narrative. And then you've got independent media out there of people who are extremely highly informed, experts that understand the historical context. And there are platforms where they can, talk to the public. So if there isn't a shake-up in the mainstream media, I think we'll find a lot of journalists in the end unemployed.
I think it's happening, but I take your point about all the others who aren't committed to the truth, are disinformers and monetisers of hate and fear and prejudice. They will also get a market as well. So it's incumbent on all journalists of good faith in the world to try and strive to put the truth first. On that positive note, after and watching a desperate situation in Gaza, Mary, you've been wonderful. Thanks very much indeed for participating in this podcast.
Thanks for the opportunity, Quentin.